This is my 2008 Dodge 2500 four-wheel drive quad cab 6.7 liter diesel. I had a little disaster with it a few days back. The belt broke on it, the serpentine belt. Call it a fan belt or an alternator belt or a power steering belt or water pump belt or whatever. It's all of those. I was out on a logging road and took the dogs for a walk, and I just started the truck up and started back down the road when I heard something dragging underneath it. I thought maybe I picked up a branch or something. I stopped to get out to look, and when I stopped it went kerpow, and then the pieces went all over the place on the thing. So we had to park it there, and that's kind of a pain in the butt to park when you don't have any brakes. Of course, the power steering goes out. I didn't know the power brakes run off of that pump and stuff too. Anyway, the water pump went out, and I should have known that was going out. I knew there was something wrong with the truck. It didn't overheat or anything, but it did use some water, and it gurgled when I shut it down. It was dripping, and I should have known it was the water pump. But I was kind of ignoring everything. I was hoping everything would last long enough to get through the summer here. Building a new airplane or rebuilding an airplane, and I'm trying to get it together for the summer season so I can use it to work with. Didn't want to deal with anything else until I get that airplane back in the water, back in the air. It's a float plane, so it goes in the water and in the air. If I'd have been paying attention and thinking, I would have figured it out, because water pumps have a weep hole in them. There's a bearing on the outside end, and well, of course, you got the pulley on the outside end that turns it, and the shaft, and then there's a bearing on that, and then there's a seal, and then it goes into the impeller. But most water pumps have a weep hole in them, so when that seal between the impeller, the seal on the shaft between the impeller and the bearing starts going bad, and the reason the seal usually goes bad is because the bearing is going bad, and when that seal goes out, there's a weep hole between the seal and the bearing, and the water that goes out, that leaks through the seal, goes out from that weep hole, and it shows up. It's a telltale. Well, anyway, I should have known what was going on, but like I said, I wasn't paying enough attention, and I wanted it not to be anything wrong with it because I didn't want to work on it. But now we're committed to working on it. Now we've got to do something with it. I got the parts for it. I ordered a new serpentine belt, and I ordered a new water pump, and I ordered a new belt tensioner. Not because I know that this one is bad, but because the belt tensioner is just an idler with a spring in it that pulls back and puts the tension on the belt, and it's got a bearing in it. Of course, it's a sealed bearing, and the bearing in the water pump was going out, so there's a good chance that the bearing in that tensioner is going out. This truck has about 136,000 miles on it, I believe. Maybe all the bearings and all of the things are going out, I don't know. So I looked online, and I did see a couple videos on there that showed how to change the water pump. One of them was a pretty poor video, and the other one was a pretty good video. It wasn't exactly on this model of truck. It was on a 2002, I believe. But basically it's the same thing. So I don't really need to make a video of this. Somebody else has already made a good one on it, but I'm going to do it anyway. So now the first thing you would do on that is to drain the water, drain the coolant out of the radiator. You're going to get the coolant level down below the level of the water pump anyway. But I'm not going to do that yet. The first thing I'm going to do is something else. 9 months ago or so, we had another little disaster with the truck. The right front tire blew out, and it blew up, and it tore up the front fender, bent it a little bit, and it tore up the fender liner. The fender liner is fairly cheap. I think they're $30 or something like that. There's not much to them, but I couldn't find anybody to ship one up here. Meanwhile, all the road crap and everything is getting slung up into the engine compartment. So we've got gravel and dirt and all kinds of crap all over here on this right side. It's all over the engine. It's got the battery all over there. So the first thing I'm going to do before I do anything else is going to get the water hose, and I'm going to hose all that stuff out and get that cleaned out. I'm going to take the intake off here. That's easy to get off. This air filter and this intake system is easy to get off and gives you a lot more room to get in there once it's off. But before I take it off, I want it clean in there. I don't want any crap falling down in to my turbocharger or getting in the water system. So that's what we're going to do first, is clean that stuff up. Now the first official thing to do is to drain the radiator, or to start draining the radiator. This thing holds a lot of water. I got a 6-gallon bucket underneath there, or 7-gallon bucket underneath there. It's something I got when my wife worked at the swimming pool that pool chemicals came in. Anyway, I stuck that underneath there, underneath the radiator, and opened it up. The petcock is on the left side. It's kind of a phony plastic petcock in there, kind of like everything else on these trucks and stuff anymore. It's, let's see, probably can't see it. Maybe see it down through there, I don't know. Okay, there's the petcock right down there. Probably won't focus on it there. Oh yeah, it did. Okay, that's the petcock right down there. I can't get it from underneath because the bucket's in the way. I got that 7-gallon bucket there, and it just barely fits underneath the truck. And I couldn't even get my hand in there to turn that petcock. But anyway, that's it. It's draining the water out. Okay. Step number 2 or 3, depending on how you're counting, on here. It wasn't on the list of that guy's video that he put on there of changing that water pump, but it's a good idea anytime you're working around the engine in particular. And some other things is I disconnected the batteries, and what I did, we've got 2 batteries here, one on each side, and I just disconnected the negative terminals on both of them, and that effectively disconnects the battery. But the negative terminals are the ones least likely to spark or arc or short out if you accidentally touch a tool to the chassis of the truck anywhere. So that should be the first one you disconnect. Well, the water pump is down in that mess there. I'm going to take out the air box here, the air filter, and I usually do that anyway when I change the oil filter and stuff. It's the easiest way I've found to get to the oil filter. And the way I do that is I take a nut driver and disconnect the hose clamp down there on this intake hose off the turbocharger and pull it out, and then you can unsnap these wire couplings. There's 2 of them on here. One of them's for the mass airflow and one of them's for the thermometer, and take those off and let those hang down out of the way, and then just unsnap this top here, 2 snaps on that, and that cover comes off for the air filter, and then you can take the whole box out, and it just has a nut right here. I think that's a 10mm wrench that takes that nut off of there, and then there's some molded in mounts on this battery box, and there's tabs on the air box that fit down in that, and you just kind of have to pop those out of there. I've got the air box off of there, and there are 2 little tabs, or 2 probes, prongs, whatever you want to call them, that go down in to this grommets on that battery box there, the battery hold down box. Well, you have to be careful taking these on and off. I have busted off those prongs, those tabs on that battery box before. There they are. Yeah, you can see them. Anyway, I broke one of those off, and I wound up getting a new battery box to put in there, because then the air box just bounces around quite a bit. The cover for the air box and the tube and everything comes off. Those wires for those sensors, they have a little tab that mounts right in there, so I've got to pull that to get this thing out of the way. And that does a pretty good job of exposing the air inside of the engine. That makes it a lot easier to work in there. Now, I did take a shop rag and stuffed in there in the turbocharger just to make sure that no crap gets knocked in there while we're working on this. And I got to make sure and pull that rag out of there. If you don't put that all together, it'd kind of spoil your day when that gets sucked into the turbocharger. Now we'll see what we can do here. Still got wires in the way here off the solenoids, and the positive terminal off the battery. I might loosen some of those up, move them around. Yeah, I'm going to move those around. And then the water pump is in there behind the alternator. So let me look around in there and see what I'm going to do next. Well, doing a little poking around in there, I can see definitely that the water pump's out. I can grab that pulley on that water pump and just move that shaft a couple inches up and down either way, so that bearing is totally shot in there. I can get the water pump out without taking that idler out of there, that tensioner out of there, but the gap between the tensioner and the engine block is so thin that it's a tough getting a belt in there. So I could see why the guys were loosening that tensioner up, either taking it off or just loosening it up and pulling it out to make it easier to get the belt on there. But one of the things that happened is that belt just shredded. And it's a serpentine belt. It's got grooves in it, and each one of those grooves, most of them just came apart. And so we've got all kinds of these little strings. You can see this is a wire embedded in that plastic, which makes that belt pretty tough. But I've got strings in there wrapped around that fan. I'm thinking I might take that alternator off of there. If I take that alternator off of there, it'll make it a lot easier to get in there to work on the rest of that stuff. And it's just 2 bolts holding that alternator on there, and I can just lay that alternator down. I don't need to take all of the, although everything is just plug in on the thing. You don't have to take anything off as far as nuts and bolts or anything. It's all just plug in, so that'd be easy enough to take the wiring harness off of there too. So we'll see how it goes and get in there a little more, but that would give me a lot more room to get in there to fish all this these strings out of there from that belt. They're tangled up pretty good around that. Well, I went ahead and took that alternator out of there. Just 2 bolts. I had to use a pry bar to get it loose from the mount plates on there. It slides in there pretty tight, but it came out pretty easy. Like I said, they're just 2 bolts. It takes a 15mm socket or wrench to turn those bolts out of there. And like I said, the wiring harness just clips right onto the back, so that was simple to get it off. So rather than leaving that hang in there and a chance of tearing up some of the wiring harness, I just took it out and set it here on a stump to get it out of the way. So that opens that up in there now. I can get in there without scraping my hands on that alternator and that fan shroud and stuff. So I can fish all of those shards of that, those ropes of that belt out of there and get that mess cleaned up, and then get in there and change that water pump. And I'm going to go ahead and change that tensioner too, since I got a new tensioner. And now I can check all of those soft hoses and stuff and see if any of them were damaged when that fan belt was ripping around there. Wires in that belt would act just like a saw, so it'll give me a chance to inspect everything a lot better. Well, here's my water pump. You can see it moves around there pretty good. That bearing is completely gone. I got all the miles out of it that I'm going to get. I used to rebuild water pumps, but the price of them anymore, they're not worth rebuilding. That's it. It's sure easy to get in there now with that alternator out of the way. It beats trying to fight with this shroud and some of the stuff those other guys I saw were doing. Well, here's the tensioner, and it spins pretty good. It's got a little bit of wobble in it. I'm going to change it anyway. And that's just got 1 nut on here, I think, that holds that on there right here in the front. This is probably the winding, spring winding in there. And we got all kinds of strings in there from that old fan belt tearing apart in there. So that's the first thing I'm going to do, is start trying to clean that crap out of there. And that way I won't get any parts or pieces or anything going into that water chamber when I take that pump off of there. So yeah, taking that alternator off of there, that's the way to go, rather than screwing with all the rest of that stuff. That just opens that right up, and it just takes a minute or 2 to take those 2 bolts out of there. I got all those strings from that belt out of there. They were wrapped around that fan. You got to be real careful with that, because like I said before, there's wire cable embedded in that, and that stuff can cut the crap out of your hands if you pull on it too hard and let it slide or something. I didn't get cut any, but it'd be real easy to do. Got the old tensioner off of there, and it's not in too bad a shape. It's worn, cut in and stuff from dirt, and it's got just a little bit of wiggle in it, but it looks like it's probably just plastic bearing on there. I don't feel any bearing or anything in there. I think it's just plastic. There's a little nipple on here that goes in a tab or a hole in the mounting plate, and that's what gives you your spring tension. You got to have that mounted in the right spot. Otherwise that is what winds up the spring to give you your correct tension on that belt. This is the new one. It's a Gates. Actually, it's heavier. Yeah, it's half again as heavy as the old one, maybe more. It's cast aluminum. It's got the nipple on there. It's got a heavier plastic wheel on it than the old one. The old one spun freely. This one's tight, and there's no movement in it at all. That takes a 13 millimeter wrench to get it off, and because the way where it's at in there with that fan, that shroud around there, I couldn't get a socket and a socket wrench on there, a ratchet on there, so I used a wrench here, a long one, to get it started, and then just a ratcheting wrench to finish it off. Well, here's the water pump. Here's the old one. Look at the way that thing is moving around there. That's flopping around pretty good. There's a seal. It's got a real thick rubber seal that goes in the groove right there. Seals that on there. Oh, it just fits in the cavity in the block itself, and the impeller on here, yeah, it's chewed up. You can see the impeller's chewed up there too. For some reason, I don't know why that. I guess because it's just flopping around. Must have been contacting on the side or something. Here's a new one. Here's the weep hole here. That should probably go down. Oh, that would go on there like that, I guess. This is a Gates. It's nice and tight. It'll go back on there. There's a new gasket on there. That takes a 10 millimeter wrench to get that off of there. And I tried using a 10 millimeter box end wrench, and you couldn't get it in that lower bolt because it was too tight of a clearance between the bolt head and the case on the, or the casting on the engine. So I used a socket, 10 millimeter socket, and they're just short little bolts here. They don't take much to get them out. Once they come out, loosen up, they come out pretty good. I want to get clean that face up where that mounts on there. Oh, this was stuck in there. I couldn't get it loose. I tapped on it a few times with a hammer, and it still wouldn't come loose. I tried finding a place to pry on it a little bit to get it to pop loose, and it wouldn't come loose. Finally got a steel rod here and stuck in there and hit it with a hammer on these castings right here, and kept popping on it a little bit here and there, and back and forth until I got it to pop loose. So it was glued in there pretty good. I've got this stuff called C-lube. The C-lube is meant for going on systems of water, gaskets, hoses, where you slide hoses together, whether water or water-based liquid is going to be, something like that. So I'm going to lubricate this gasket with that, this seal with that, and put it in there. And then, because this thing was a little bit tough to get off, I'm going to go ahead and wipe some on the metal surface of this, just a thin layer. I don't want it gooped on there or anything, just a thin layer on there to help keep this from rusting down. So the next time I change this, I should be able to get another 120,000 miles or so out of it before I need to change it again, I hope. But the next time I have to change this, it won't be stuck so bad to that case. Who knows, I might be 80 years old instead of 70 years old next time I were to change it. Might not be able to get it off of there. I don't want to have to fight it. The pump is in, and I originally started to put that in to put the weep hole down. I mean, logically you'd think that the weep hole would go down so the water would run out of it, but no, those ears are not symmetrical on that. That's not a symmetrical shape on that. I had to turn it around so that the weep hole went up to get the holes to line up. Well, I got a new belt, of course. I don't think I was going to patch that old one back up. Anyway, this winds up being a Gates green belt. I didn't know the difference on them when I was buying this, but after looking at some other things on YouTube or some other sites and stuff, I guess the green belt is a good one. It's a heavier duty one. I bought all this stuff on Amazon, and the price between this one and the standard one was not that much, so I went ahead and got the heavy duty one, and it's green on one side, so I guess that's why it's a green belt. I just screwed up and wasted a bunch of time. I'd copied the wrong belt diagram off the internet, And then I wasted a bunch of time. I just assumed that I had to run that belt over the fan to get it on there. I mean, that's what you'd have to do back in the old days with a fan driven, a regular fan that drove everything, the alternator belt and all of that. But these serpentine belts are different. So that doesn't have to go over the fan. The belt goes over the idler over here in the top, and then down around the power steering pump, and then up over the top of the fan, and then down under the crankshaft, and then up over the idler and around the air conditioning pump. And that other diagram I had didn't have the air conditioning pump on there. So anyway, I got it all screwed up and wasted a whole bunch of time. You don't need to put that belt around the fan. I got it around the fan most of the way, but you can't put it around the fan anyway because it's an electric fan, and there's a wire that goes up through in the front of the fan that activate the fan to turn it on and off. That wasted a whole bunch of time that I didn't need to. But now I got it figured out, and again, it's pretty obvious. All of the belts here that have grooves in them is where the groove side goes down, and then the smooth belts are where the smooth side goes on it. So well, you got it on there, got the belt on there, water pump's on there, the new tensioner's on there, you got everything all routed around there. And then I put the alternator on, figuring I could set that tensioner and put that belt on there on the alternator once I got it on. But we had a heck of a time with that. This tensioner, well, it mounts like this. There's a hole in the pad that it mounts on here, with this socket goes into, and then the bolt goes in there. I had a little bit of trouble finding that because there's 2 or 3 holes on that pad, and the tensioner knob fit into, but it didn't thread in, so I had to pull that out a ways and look and find the hole, the threaded hole, and put the bolt in there first, get it started, and then line the nipple up in the hole where it goes there. But we got it, and the tensioner comes with a new bolt to hold it down too. So there's a square socket in this tensioner, and they make special tools for that to hook in there, serpentine belt tensioner tools and stuff that slip right in there. But this is kind of a one-time thing for me. I don't need to spend money for a tool, but a 1/2-inch drive off of like a 1/2-inch drive ratchet will fit in there. So I put a 1/2-inch drive breaker bar in there, so it was long enough that I could reach from up here and get it in there, but I couldn't get enough movement on it. The problem with this thing is it sits like this, and the square drive has to fit in this socket, and it's square. So like on a breaker bar, you don't have any movement, any adjustment on it to get any different purchase on it. It's going to stay fixed. And so we get it, and we get almost enough slack in the belt to get it over the alternator pulley, but not quite enough because it would run into that fan shaft. I went underneath, and you couldn't get it from underneath either, but I wound up getting a 1/2-inch drive ratchet and putting on it, and then with a 1/2-inch drive ratchet, then you could move the ratchet back after you got this end of it, the drive, into this socket, and then you could get another purchase on it and move it more. So I had to get my wife out to come and help me, and we did it from underneath, and we still had to put a cheater pipe on the ratchet to get it long enough to get enough movement on it. This spring winds up pretty tight in here, but she got underneath and she moved it, had to ratchet it a couple times and got it. Actually, I did it. I moved the tensioner and she put the belt on. And then we got to looking, and the belt was not quite lined up on the water pump pulley the way I wanted it, so we got back down in there again, and it just had to loosen it up a little bit, and we got the belt lined up, and it's lined up on all the pulleys now just the way it should be. So a ratchet works better on this, as there's too many protrusions in here to get around with just a breaker bar or a solid bar. Well, we got that thing mounted up on there now. That's all back together. All my pulleys are routed, or my belt is routed right correctly on all the pulleys and everything. So now I'll start putting everything else back together. Well, I got this all back together. I got the batteries hooked up, got the air box back on, and the intake tube and everything all lined back up, all the wiring hooked back up. Hopefully it's right. It's ready to go, except there's no water in the radiator. Now, it's supposed to fill that up 50-50 with antifreeze, but I'm just going to put water in it for right now. I want to flush it a couple of times and then before I put fresh antifreeze in it. So I'm going to run it a little bit with just plain water in it and then flush that out and then fill it up with water again and flush it out before I change it and put fresh antifreeze in it. The only difficulty that I had on that was when I screwed up and tried to run that belt around the fan blade to get it around there. That was kind of a stupid screw up. And the other thing that gave me a little bit of trouble was getting that tensioner loosened up to get that belt back on over the alternator. Then we used a ratchet with a little cheater bar on it so we could get it out far enough to clear the radiator shroud and everything underneath. Once we got that figured out, then it was a piece of cake. So if I'd have done that ahead of time, it wouldn't have taken me any time at all to do that. All in all, I spent probably about 3-4 hours doing this, but some of that was researching online to get the right diagram for the belt line up on it, and part of it was screwing around with that belt, trying to line it up the wrong way. And then I screwed around by myself for a while trying to get that tensioner rigged up right before I finally called my wife, and then we fooled around with it for a while with her helping me. And then when we finally figured out how to do that, then it went pretty fast. So, and of course I stopped and had lunch during that, a couple other things. So I'm not a real speed demon anymore, but if I'd have just done it, if I'd known what I was doing ahead of time and just done it, probably would have taken an hour. Pulling that alternator was the right thing to do. It sure made it a lot easier working on everything. So I'm going to put water in this thing now and I guess and start it up and see if it blows up. Oh, I did check underneath. I looked in the book in the Dodge manuals that come with the truck, the owner's manual, and it didn't have a diagram in there for those belts. I thought it would have a diagram for the belt, but it didn't. It just said to inspect your belts once in a while. If they're afraid to replace it, and watch the speed sensor, which is mounted underneath down by the dampener, because it can get damaged if the belt gets frayed. So I did look at that. When I crawled underneath it to route that belt, it did help to crawl underneath to route that belt around that damper. And then when we were fooling around down underneath there, I dug out some more pieces of belt. And I did notice that speed sensor mounted on there. It looks like it's got a steel probe that sticks out, and it's encased in plastic. And it did look like some of the plastic was chipped off of it. So I may look for a new speed sensor to replace that. I don't know if it's damaged. I mean, I can see that it's damaged, but I don't know if it's damaged to the point where it's non-functional or not. So I'll probably look for a new one of those. So that's something to look for. Probably if you have the same thing I did where a belt comes apart on you, you might want to just go ahead and buy one of those and then change it while you're at it.